Okay, I'm here for another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is going to be Snoopeh, former jungler of teams such as CLG.EU, Evil Geniuses. So, to start this interview, right, one detail that I'm actually always
Got
confused about.
absolute legend, by the way.
Absolute Legends? I don't think anyone remembers that team, mate. But anyway, to start the interview, right, one detail that I'm a bit confused by, even though I've actually read many of your interviews in the past, is you did like a whole university degree and were a pro player. So presumably, based on the years when you played, was the beginning of League of Legends while you were still at university?
So when I first started playing professionally, I was at university studying computer science in Scotland. And gradually, I became more and more interested in playing video games for a living and started traveling a lot. And maintaining being at university and traveling like at least once a month was pretty impossible. And I got like really bad at one point where I just like my participation rate or my attendance rate was like 40% or something, and it was got to be above 75 or something like that.
Okay.
And I don't know if you remember, we went to a tournament. It was at IEM Guangzhou.
Yes. End of 2011, right?
Yeah, and in 2011. And I went to that tournament, and I came back. I came back from that tournament, and I went to tell my dad. I was like, "Dude, Dad, I went to China. It was the best thing ever." He went there once or twice for work, and was like, "Oh, China's so amazing." And I went there, and it means I was a kid from Scotland. I never ever traveled, really anywhere, especially not Asia, and was absolutely blown away. And I couldn't wait to tell him when I got home, like, "Oh my God, this trip was amazing." And I got back, and he was like going to work in the morning, and like he was late, and he didn't get up. But the next day, I got a call, and he was at work, and he'd been put in hospital. And then some of you know my story, but some of you don't. My dad had cancer. I went to the hospital to meet him there with my mom. And I couldn't wait to tell him about this amazing trip in China. Like, he'd been fighting cancer for 2 years, so it was like expected that these things, that he goes to hospital like fairly regular basis. I get to the hospital, and he's just getting put under for like an endoscopy, your throat, all that kind of stuff. And I never really got to tell him about how awesome that trip was to China, because he passed away under the anesthetic that day. So for me, that was like a big catalyst in my life where I decided to pursue what I was passionate about, and actually deferred I basically dropped out. At first I put it as a deferred, that I wasn't going to continue with university for like a year or two and just postpone it. And I ended up just dropping out entirely. So I did for 2.5 years, did a computer science and business management, but I didn't do it any further after that.
Okay. Because obviously, I mean, the question then is, if that unfortunate set of circumstances didn't arise, what was your plan at the time? Like, presumably you were still going to try and balance both, but it sounds like it was impossible. I mean, I know when you said there you had to have 75% attendance rate, like even a bad university, I think has like 40%, it doesn't matter even if you pass all the coursework, you still have to go a certain amount of the time. And at that point in time, like, this was like pre-season 2, I think. And season 2 obviously was a big open circuit, so you have to travel every month. And then obviously LCS would have been impossible, that's like 9-10 weeks in Germany. So did you have, like, put it this way, were you actually considering maybe you had to quit the esports side of things at that point in time? Were you already on the fence? Where were you?
For me, I wasn't on the fence. I was definitely like, I love this. I wasn't necessarily in my hometown in Scotland the best at something. And now in this global game, League of Legends, I was one of the best in the world. And I was getting the opportunity to travel and see the world. So for me, it wasn't a question. But where it became really difficult is with my mom. I mean, how do you tell your mom, like, you're going to go pursue this gaming thing where you're earning like $0? At that time, I was getting like nothing a month. I'm going to drop out of university and like play video games for a living. And I was like the first of the family to go to university. And my mom just lost my dad. And she's just like, what the hell? So that was the hardest part of it, not me and my conviction to like go pursue this,
More like
this career path. Yeah, it was more like I felt like a little shit, you know, that I was just like dropping out of university and giving up on like the only concrete thing in my life at that point to go pursue gaming, which was very hard for my mom to understand at the time. But for me, it was like a no-brainer. I was like, getting the opportunity to compete in front of like thousands of people, be the best at something, and travel the world. I was all for it.
So did you actually, was it when you retired that you finished your degree then? Did you do some of it like online or something while you were still in like Evil Geniuses or something? How did you wind up finishing your degree?
I didn't wrap it up. Okay. No, I never got the chance to go back and complete it. Part of me was like, should I go try and continue this? And then I learned that honestly, I didn't really need it. I never really needed my degree. And that's not the case for everyone, but the life experience that I got through kind of esports and traveling, never went and revisited and got my degree.
Okay. So around this period in time, another thing I thought would be interesting to ask you about, since you are, while you actually aren't like literally the most OG guy, because actually these teams were like, there'd still been a couple of teams and like a few online tournaments before this. This is still very early in League of Legends as an esport. And I remember back at that time that League of Legends wasn't even one of the main esports games, because at the time when I used to work as an esports journalist, like I always tell people, the reason why to me, ignoring all other factors, season 1 doesn't really feel like the World Championship is because I was at the tournament that was at. It was a DreamHack Summer. And at the time, League of Legends was actually competing with other MOBAs, because actually at this tournament, they had like, I think they had like that Heroes of Avalon one, and I think they might have had Hon, and I think Dota hadn't come out obviously yet. I think that was later that year. So I remember at this tournament, you know, it was just one of what looked like a whole bunch of games, and they were all kind of battling at the time, you know, like who's going to make it, who's going to survive. And so the scenes within those games, as you said here, salary-wise, you know, it wasn't at the level of like a Counter-Strike or something like that, you know, and even though you could be on a team such as SK, which yes, obviously is in Counter-Strike and StarCraft, etc., it was a very, very small scene in terms of League, right? So where was it actually at in the pro scene? Because I know back then, as far as I know, weren't the only competitions stuff like Go for LOLs and like these small sort of community cups, but which still had, because it was such a small scene, the big teams in them, right? So how if you're back then, do you go about getting into a team and then finding teammates, and then how does it develop? Because obviously it kind of ramped up pretty quick after that, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was already somewhat into esports, in that I followed CS from the 1.6 day, or like 1.5, 1.6 days.
Sure.
I had a background understanding of esports, but like how I became competitive in League was I basically just played a lot of League and got really good in the European ladder. So, you know, you have like in the client, you have like your rankings list in the client.
Yes.
And I got to the very top in Europe, and I was one of the few junglers at the top. And then what happens is you just like play repeatedly. You're constantly playing with the same people at the very top. Some of those people are in clans. And for me, it was Absolute Legends, that team that I made a joke about at the start of the video. That was one of my first teams. And, or was it Absolute Legends or SK? I can't even remember now. It was a while ago, but I got picked up by the team initially, and we just played Go for LOLs. And for those of you that don't know, Go for LOL is like ESL's monthly ladder, and I don't even know if it still exists. €100. You could play for like a full month and get like €100 or €500 split between the 5 people in the team. And that was like our competitive ecosystem to start with in League of Legends. And then that kind of evolved to like your dream hacks or your ESL events. And you're right, like it was such a small ecosystem. I mean, I remember like I was getting paid $0 to $300 a month and like flying to China to represent a team. And that's what my career was, you know? It was cool because I was traveling, I had all this gear sponsored, and they paid for the travel. But I dropped out of university to make no money at all at that point in time. And there was no such thing as like a thriving like viewership on a Twitch or whatever, right? It was the amount of people that turned up to the event was like likely the amount of people watching that. It was really small when it first started.
Sure. Because, I mean, like, as you referenced, you were in SK Gaming, was one of the first big teams, and this was the team that obviously had Ocelot already at this point in time. They had Wickd, who obviously you actually kind of went with to your next team, right? I realized at the time, you know, as we were talking about, the scene's pretty small. It's a small group of people. There's lots of new people coming in as well. So it's not like it's some ridiculous, you know, move like, why did he leave that team? But this was an established brand, you know, and you had some players that were good, and you'd had some decent LAN results. So why did you decide to make that team where it basically the lineup that became CLG.EU, which was kind of like, there was a bit of risk involved, right? Some of these players weren't that known. In fact, actually, Froggen wasn't super well known at the time. Why make that move?
It was, so, yeah, I remember it was SK, then Absolute Legend, then CLG.EU. And when we were on SK, we actually came off a pretty good streak. Like, we were third in IEM Guangzhou, then which is a big international competition at the time. Then we went to New York, like 2 weeks later, got second in New York, and like just lost to Fnatic. And we were pretty much one of the best teams in the world at League at that point, barring Asia. And the problem became egos was one thing. I mean, I had dinner with Carlos or Ocelot 2 nights ago, actually, at IEM Oakland. And we were just kind of reminiscing on the past. And basically, our egos were so big that it was too big to be in one team. And we just butted heads a lot in that particular team. And we felt that the org wasn't treating us well enough or couldn't treat us all well enough. Like SK has X amount of resources and they can only, you know, help their star player, which was Carlos at the time. Yes. He was the kind of leading man, the front runner, brand, like head of the brand or whatever.
I mean, I can say, because obviously I actually worked with SK at the time, I actually know that Alex Muller, the guy who was the managing director of SK Gaming and is still involved with the team, he actually even told me, not in any kind of a secret manner, you know, in teams, what he would do in the team games was he'd pick someone kind of like the captain figure. And what he would do is, because he can't, you know, have a relationship with every player when he's got like many different teams and many different esports games, he would be like, right, I'll pick my guy where I think this guy's like, you know, got the right mindset or he fits with the SK brand. And it's more like, right, he kind of gets some autonomy, like he'll kind of pick the team and obviously from the outside people can see for a couple of years Ocelot really was kind of the guy, it seemed, running the team and picking who got to play and what the style was and stuff. So that was actually kind of understood within the team, though. It was clear that he was the guy in charge.
Well, understood is one way to put it. It was seen, and then there was a problem with it, right? Like it wasn't like he's leader, we get it. You know, it was, this is a problem. We don't like the direction of the team. We want to explore alternatives. And Wickd was also like, I mean, I would say I was probably more opinionated than Wickd on this.
Okay.
But Wickd also, like, if you remember Wickd back in 2011, like he really wanted to be be a star as well in his own right, you know, like be one of the best. And that led to the both of us just think like, and Wickd knew Froggen. He was like, oh, I have this like young Danish like guy that I think's really good. And I had known George pretty well, and we kind of just put all the dots together. And at first, it was kind of Absolute Legends was like a test bed, and that then led to us making a deal with CLG heading into 2012. I think it was, 2012.
Yes. Because, okay, then I feel like that actually provides an interesting thread for the CLG team, because obviously one of the things this CLG.EU team was very famous for was having like very cohesive team play and everyone kind of understood and was on the same page. But I also remember it was one of the first instances I remember of a team where in every interview and every comment, it was always stressed that it was supposed to be like a total democracy, you know, like in the game, even we kind of decide based on, you know, we have a discussion about what's happening in the match. No one is like technically in charge of the others or is the shot caller, you know? So what's this actually presumably something you wanted right from the outset?
Yeah, so I would have said I would probably sort of taken a more managerial, like captainy role within CLG.EU. But from the get-go, it was, we're going to go into this agreement with CLG at the time that everyone was equal. So when we were negotiating things like salaries, it was negotiated as a package. It wasn't negotiated like Snoopeh's the brand guy and he'll get like 10K, and then Froggen's obviously a star mid laner, he'll get 6K, and then everyone else gets like that. It was like everyone gets the same salary. Everyone knows what everyone's salary is, and we're all in this together. And that worked really, really well. That like level setting and equality in the team kind of removed egos, not forever, but for a while, and was just a really healthy dynamic for a team environment.
In this team, since part of the whole mythos of like coming from behind in all these games and having the really great team fighting that would win you out all these matches, right? How much of the team's style was actually conscious or was strategical or something that you actually figured out? Because if you look at the team at the time, the results meant that people would think, oh, these are all really good players. But put it this way, if we made like a Hall of Fame of League of Legends players, not everyone in this team would make it in, you know? Some players were just of their time.
What are you trying to say, Duncan? What are you trying to say? Come on, give me some names.
Well, basically everyone except Froggen, right? You can, I mean, Wicked's borderline. The rest of you know, like, you can fend for yourselves, right? No, the point here is, you know, it very much was more like one of the old cliche, you know, more than the sum of the parts. Right? How much of it was like, did you know when you had this lineup early on, like how each player should play and how you're going to have this style and how it's all going to come together? Was it fluke? Was it happenstance? How did it happen?
Definitely, it was not calculated. Like going into it, we're kids, you know, like we were anywhere between 17 to 20, and we like weren't that methodical, and there was no one else telling us what to do. We were our own bosses in a sense. No one was like crafting this team scientifically or anything like that. We just made sure to like make everyone feel equal, and it was good because we had a nice kind of arrangement of ages. So there was some maturity brought to the team, balanced by like the hungry young blood in like Froggen and Wickd. And over the course of a few months of playing together, and like obviously there was a lot of like major talent. Like Froggen was obviously really good. Wickd at the time was really, really good. Pete and Krepo had like great synergy. You know, they were like really good buddies and kind of worked together and each other. And then I was just generally like quite a level-headed person in the team, and then over a couple of months, like we just played together more and more, and we got like some wins here and there. We started to learn like what worked for our team, and we learned that it was something that we could leverage over time. That we knew that where people or teams would typically give up or break, we didn't have that breaking point. So it did become like a craft that or like a science as the team matured. But at the offset, it wasn't like we crafted it that way.
Okay. So another aspect about this era that's very unique in the pro League of Legends history, because we never had this from Season 3 onwards, is that obviously you not only competed in LAN tournaments, but simultaneously people would play in online tournaments. And in fact, some of them crazy, like there'd be transatlantic international, you know, like online tournaments where you'd play an American team with 150 ping or whatever. So since you had this component, I noticed that was always part of the context of a lot of the results that actually gets missed if you just go to like, you know, an esports wiki and you look at the LAN results, because you don't realize, you know, for example, this team, obviously one of the first places you had your success actually was online, right? The first couple of LANs weren't so great, and then you got this little streak going online, and then you came in with the big summer run where you beat Moscow 5, etc. So how much was online important at the time, and did people just play, since you played so many tournaments, was it really just like you just play the games? Was there actually much practice involved around this time?
It was really important because we weren't, remember, like this is really early in the new era of esports, I guess, was relative, in League, it was really new era. So we didn't have like big budgets. We didn't have like gaming houses that were like well funded. So a lot of us were still playing at home, you know, and we had players from all over. Like Krepo was from Belgium, Pete was from Germany, Wickd and Froggen were from Denmark, and I was from Scotland. So in those initial few months of the team being formed, if we didn't play in those online leagues, we would never have practiced as hard and never have like built like such cohesion so early on to like prepare us for that big knockout like summer. So yeah, like online was like absolutely critical. And the fact that that online like tournament ecosystem existed early on was really important.
So obviously, Right, people already are going to think I'm going to skip straight to the epic like DreamHack with the Moscow. I actually want to ask quickly though. We don't have to spend too much time on it, but a lot of people forget with this team that your first LAN was that French LAN. I forget the name. I think it was like I forget the name actually. I don't remember what the name of the LAN was. But it was this one where you went and you actually.
Was it in Lille or something? Was it in Lille? I can't remember. But I know what you're talking about.
Sure, yes, but it was this one where you only came like fourth or something along those lines, you know, and actually it was kind of like a little bit underwhelming, right? Like the teams that beat you, they weren't like the great teams of all time or whatever, you know. So, do you have any memories of that? Like why the first offline event wasn't as good?
Well, that was the funny thing. We were dominating online. If you look at our results, or doing really well at least.
Yes.
And that was the first time we'd actually all five met in person, you know, at an event. And it was interesting. It didn't translate right away into a real world environment, you know, like a LAN environment or online success, because you're in the comfort of your home, you've got a groove, you've got a gel, you know, like this was the first time the team had to come together in that physical like place and have the same kind of fortitude and like discipline as we were able to in the comfort of our own home. And that was just something we weren't ready for. And it was a bit of a culture shock as well, because you think you're dealing with a bunch of like gamers that hadn't like been outside much, you know, like never been traveling.
Sure.
And they're going to this new like place, new culture, and you've got all these like distractions and things going on. And I don't think you can be expected to like, and you've got fans. I mean, none of us had really had fans that much before. Me and Wickd a little bit, but the rest of the guys didn't. And there's like press and journalists, and you're in this LAN environment that's really noisy. So even though we did have higher expectations of ourselves, and the community did, I still like, I can see exactly why it happened. You know, why our first LAN was not great.
Sure. So, okay, then let's build into the first big kind of like cool story point, which was the DreamHack Summer one, where you went to this tournament and already Moscow 5 was established as like the #1 team, you know, they'd won the IEM tournament, they'd only been to a couple of LANs and they'd basically won them all like close to undefeated, you know, they were very, very strong at the time. Now, online, I know you'd beaten them already, but first of all, you have to add in the factor that like, you know, as you're saying here, like online, offline is a bit different when you get to the top. Secondly, obviously they did play from like Russia, etc. So famously, the internet obviously wasn't quite as good back then in those countries. So there's, you know, I'm sure in their minds they thought, oh, who cares about these online results? Like actually, Moscow 5 didn't win most of the online tournaments, even though they were considered #1. You know. So what happened in this tournament where you obviously beat them in the group stage was the epic game everyone remembers, where it was like the super long game where you came back and you had to just defend in your base. But then in the final, you just beat them straight up in a best of 3. So this must have been a significant turnaround from, as you said, the first LAN was kind of like, you know, teething problems, whatever you'd use the old cliche. Now, what turned this team into a championship team, and what do you think? What can you remember of this tournament?
I remember it was not the online qualifiers.
I think you had to go through the BYOC to actually get in the tournament, right?
Yeah, but was there not online qualifiers to first like decide how you got in, and we like didn't turn up to them or something, right, and we had to then play through the BYOC? Could
be, yes.
So I think something like that happened, and we were just like, fuck, like this sucks, you know? We were like one of the best teams at that point in time in Europe, at least, and we had to go through this like crazy like long BYOC process to get to the main tournament.
Yes.
And honestly, like, one of the things that brought our team together is we had like incredible fan support. So over the course of this, like 4 or 5 months of kind of being a dominant team online, and then being like loved by the community and the fans in Europe, because it was hard to like be a fan of Moscow 5. You know, there were like, yes, surely they won, but it was hard to be a fan of them unless you were.
Just for context, most of them didn't stream, and obviously a lot of them didn't speak English and never attempted to. You know, I mean, people like Genja, no one even knew who these people were. You know, they were just kind of good players, and that they were a name, right? That's it.
Yeah. So we were the fan favorites, and when you go to a tournament like DreamHack, which is one of the biggest LAN events there is, and a high concentration of esports fans, we had to go through this grueling process of BYOC, and we took like each game as it came. Like, we really believed we could do it. But that wasn't enough. It actually ended up being the fact that like fans were crowding around our computers, like cheering their heads off. At each stage, we got through this BYOC, and our morale was so high. And it was also the first like prolonged LAN. Like back then, you used to game for like 10, 12 hours at a LAN event, you know, like one team would. And it was over the course of like 3 days. But this just like general like morale high we had and fan support. And us over the course of that becoming like more tighter as a unit and gelled as a unit. We honestly felt unstoppable. Like we didn't go into that final against Moscow 5 thinking we could lose, you know? Like we felt really good as a team. Like morale was so high.
Okay. So a question I had that I thought tied in here, because everyone remembers that epic group stage game where you had to do the big comeback, and it was like, you know, I think like they were up a massive amount of gold as well. And it looked, you know, it looked like near impossible, right? One thing I always want to ask about is, like, it's hard to do interviews in League because the patches and the hero balance, etc., changes so much that, you know, the context of a match is lost. So can you give me some idea, right? Because obviously with all the different like anti-snowball mechanics and all the different factors they've brought in over the years, right? In theory, you probably couldn't do exactly this type of game, like just stay in the base, you know, and like just turtle up as much, right? What was the game meta like back then that allowed this classic sort of like come from behind style where you could sort of play defensively and still outscale somehow? What was the game like? Where was it at as a game?
Well, it was interesting. There was things called gold per 10 items back then. It's a gold per 10 and gold per 5 items back then. And basically, you would have 2 people on your team that would take up very little resources, your support and your jungler. Your jungler would be like a tanky crowd control character. And we decided it was very strategic for us to funnel all of the gold to a hyper AD carry and a mid laner. And we had a really rough start in that game. We actually, at one point, were 20,000 gold behind. Okay. But we played this composition that was really crowd control heavy and wave clear heavy. And as many know, like, Anivia was a core part of that. And we would basically be able to just turtle. So we managed to hold the front lines, or like front 3 towers outside of our base, hold that line for something like 35 minutes, and claw back a 20,000 gold deficit until we were able to first of all, it was like to get equal level like items. Yes. So grind it out until we're all like at the same item level across the Moscow 5 and us. And then it became, they had to make power plays to end the game because it was just so hard for them to end the game. So they had to make plays that they want to make. And we capitalized on that. I think I can somewhat recall it was like a Baron play where we were like starting Baron and we ran away, and then we like blind spotted them around a corner and like made a big team fight happen. And it was honestly, we just built this composition in general through, it wasn't just a Nivea strategy, it was just a composition that was limited resources on 2 characters and crowd control and wave clear that would allow us to prolong the game for as long as possible. And that's what happened in that game. We were down early to mid game and most of the late game, and we just turtled super hard until we they made them force their hand, and we capitalized on that and turned it around. And it was crazy. It was 76 or something minutes at a LAN. It was the third game, right? Duncan, that's right.
I think it was the last game, so I think you were both in the playoffs anyway.
Third game. We've been playing for 3 days straight at this point through a BYOC LAN. It was the third game of a BO3, and we're in front of like a couple of thousand people at DreamHack. And we are so high on adrenaline. We're exhausted, but we're so high on adrenaline. It was like one of the most amazing feelings in my career, like ever. It was super special.
So obviously another part of the rivalry in Moscow 5, which is almost like how you'd script it in a movie, was like not only were you the number 1 and number 2 teams in Europe, but you obviously had such contrasting styles because their team was like this super aggressive team who was winning it like 20 minutes against other teams. So since you got to battle them like back and forwards and it was obviously they won some, you won some. What was Moscow 5 good at the time?
Moscow 5 was super good. So basically, it was pinned a lot on Diamond. Diamond Prox was the jungler at the time. He played super aggressive junglers before aggressive junglers were really a thing, and he would really try and capitalize on the early game. And I was like the opposite, right? I was the guy that would like play the weaker character that scaled well into mid and late, and was a better like team jungler. And the way we dealt with that was, all I had to do and think about doing was read Diamond's mind. That's the only thing. I mean, Diamond talked about this for many years after, because we always like reminisced about that time, and we would just play chess with each other. And often I would actually outsmart him, and which is how we would win. We would just make sure that wherever Diamond was going, I would be there, and that worked sometimes, not all the times. But to make sure that wherever he was ineffective in the early game, or less effective in the early game, he'd always find a way to do it. The guy was incredibly talented. But that was the biggest thing we had to do against them in the early game, just make sure that Diamond didn't get rolling. Because that would potentially make the game run away from us. So if we could slow that down as much as possible, and then let our team comp come into play, we had a pretty good chance of beating Moscow 5. It was so funny, though. They were so... The rivalry was, they were almost like annoyed at us. Like they hated the fact that we played the way we did, because it was the exact opposite of the way they played. And they would just find it frustrating to play against us. It was pretty funny.
Okay, so as you referenced before, you've already given like a few details of the meta. Like, for example, yes, the junglers used to use the gold per 10 items. So, for example, it meant that you didn't actually have to take all the camps. And famously, especially in your team, you could just give like basically all the wolves and they've changed the names of all the camps now. But you remember them all. You could just give many of them you wanted to Froggen all the time, so he could get all the resources in himself. And so not only was he farming well, but he'd have all this extra additional resources, right? When you played in this era, a lot of people played these supportive junglers, and this was kind of the style, which is why the context of Diamond Prox was so revolutionary to a degree, right? But when you played this style, was that actually the style you liked to play? Like, did you actually enjoy it? If people look now, especially anyone who's played in the later seasons, and they see that like the jungler's got like no farm and barely any gold and any items, you know, they're going to think this sounds like a nightmare. What satisfaction could you take from playing at this era as a jungler?
I mean, yeah, I'll be honest. I wasn't selfish about it, right? Like the thing you have to realize when you're in a team game is that you only win if the team wins, right?
Sure.
So that might sound weird when you're like a competitive player and you're just like, you know, you're like Froggen, for example, right? Froggen was not as much of a team player. I don't know if that's changed now, but for many years he wasn't really a team player. He was always about himself. And if a team was full of 5 Froggens, unfortunately, that team probably might have won a few lands, but would never have been a world championship winning team.
Sure.
And that's the mentality I took, is that like, this is the role that with the team comp we have, this is the best role for me to play. And we realized that because later, as we started losing some games, like we tried to shift the way I played to be a little more aggro, and like I played like things like Jarvan, right? So it wasn't like Lee specifically, but it was like try Jarvan. It was more aggressive.
Okay. And
we found that didn't really work as well with our team and the way our team worked. You know, it wasn't like our team was really good at that strategy. And when we had to adopt that and shift that, it didn't really work as well. Because even if I got good at, say, Jarvan, the other like champions we played didn't really complement that as well. Not just Froggen, but the rest of the team.
Okay. So another aspect of season 2 that people will remember very fondly is obviously that you went to Korea to play in OGN, and that you were actually the only Western team to have a really good performance in Korea. Now, obviously, yes, Moscow 5 was good against Koreans if they played them in the West, you know, like one of these 2 or 3 day lands. But part of going to Korea, and this is something that's spilled over into every esports game, so I've seen it in StarCraft 2 and all the other games, and now Overwatch, is like, obviously these tournaments take a month, and preparation becomes a massive factor, you know, because they can study you for a week. You know, it's not like when you play someone at the end of one night, and then the guy you're playing only 2 hours before you go to sleep. You can't prep the same way. It's a lot more on like form and just how good your team is at a base level. Now, there are obviously a million environmental factors that anyone who's been to Korea knows about that you wouldn't see in the server. Like, you have to live in a team house, you have to be there for so long, it's a different culture, right? I'm sure all of these play a factor as well, but Korea was also getting very good at League at the time, right? That's another reason as to why a lot of these Western teams went there, and they were very good teams. Like CLG was a good team. The Fnatic guys were pretty good, but they went there and they kind of got made to look a bit silly. So how did your team kind of survive that and obviously almost win OGN? Why were you kind of the lone team that somehow seemingly thrived there?
So I think if you look at the rest of the team, I mean, by the way, Fnatic had great infra, CLG, NA had good infrastructure. And see, it was funny because we were the winning team. We were like the fan favorites, the winning team. Yeah, we were always second citizen in CLG,
sure,
which was pretty funny. And a lot of those teams back then, maybe with the exception of Fnatic, because Fnatic wasn't full of too many egos, but CLG was, for example. Like it was a lot of egos in that team. Like Hotshot had an ego, Chowster had an ego. Double Lift had an ego. I can't remember. Elements, say Vicious, like all those guys had egos, right? And I think the fact that our team we did have egos, but that we treat ourselves as equal, and we didn't have as much ego over, like in comparison to those other teams. That when we got to Korea and we had to deal with losing badly, by the way, we got slaughtered. Like every team that went there for the first couple of weeks got absolutely like trashed. It was insane.
I mean, and I've actually heard even from most of the teams that when you say you got trashed at that, it's not like just when you played, the best teams. I've heard like you'd be playing teams like you don't even know and they'd beat you, right?
Yeah, because we have to understand the top teams wouldn't even play against us, right? Because we were seen as like awful. And then we'd play against the worst teams and then they would just kick our ass. And for weeks, like we just got handed to us week after week, and it was like demoralizing. But I think that just given our strengths as a team and like the way we bonded over the previous like 6 months, we were set up to like be a little more battle hardened, and like prepared to weather that like streak of losing better than some of the other teams were, like CLG and Fnatic, and that really helped us. And we honestly, even though we had that going for us, like we gelled as a team, we still didn't believe we were going to get anywhere near as far as we did at OGN. It was a week by week thing. And the moment we came out of groups, that's when we started to really believe. But up until that point, we didn't really believe we had a shot at doing anything meaningful. And no one really did either, but it was cool because it was the first time that we'd lived away from home, like our team, we never had a gaming house. This was the first time we lived away from home. We'd seen each other at events, but this was a prolonged period of time. And that actually brought us even closer because we ended up being family and like big brothers abroad, which was like, we took advantage of more than any other team did. Like CLG NA, I don't think they felt that way or thought that way. Whereas we ended up just becoming closer as like as a unit, as a brotherhood or family. I don't want to cliche it too much, but that's kind of like that's what it was.
Sure. So as you've referenced here, I'm glad you gave that context because I remember we once did a Summoning Insight episode with Froggen, and when we talked about this era, right, because admittedly, it was already into like late season 4 by the time we did this episode, right? Froggen, in his usual somewhat nonchalant manner, made it sound like, like when I asked him, how did you do so well against the Koreans? He was like, they just didn't know how to team fight, and we did, so we just waited, and then they blew all their ults, and then we killed them all. Which, like, that sounds great from the outside, but as we've just referenced, all the top Western teams who were there were taking their beatings, they were having a hard time in the game and out of the game. So, in this run where you were so close to winning OGN, was there something that you had to figure out about how to play Korean teams to be successful against them?
I think there's some credit to Froggen's like team fighting and then endurance. I mean, you can see it in our play style. We were still playing in the same endurance style. Like we didn't innovate that much, right? Really, we didn't at all. We still played that same endurance style that we can have done at DreamHack. And we, as a team, had just like perfected that, you know? The idea of just kind of enduring a lot of beatings throughout a game, almost like that Rocky style. And we just got really, really good at that in farming to the late game and then waiting for the right opportunity to team fight. And our comp was always like impeccable for team fighting. We always had a great team comp. And then as we kind of got through the tournament into like past the quarters and into semis, we were just like we're on cloud nine. You know, like we believed we could win the whole thing.
So obviously in this final you played Azubu Frost, who were considered the strongest Korean team, and you would obviously rematch them in the Worlds semis, where they were also the team that knocked you out there. Again, full series, that was 3 maps. Obviously the final VOGO was 5. Right, this was a team where, to tie back into something you said before, they were the team who actually really did try to play mind games with people in terms of like practice stuff. Like, you know, famously, you know, they wouldn't always practice with people. They'd like let you practice plays and then they'd try and like pick apart things like that. So they were the team that had like the extra mystique around them, I remember at the time. Since you got to play a decent amount with them actually for a Western team, what was that side like?
Yeah, it was really frustrating playing against Frost in general, because they would never scrim against us. The pool in Korea was really small, especially as you go later on the tournament. Like, you have to remember, this is a knockout tournament, so we're not in a seasonal league or anything. Like, people who no longer are in the tournament have no need to play anymore or are flying home. So we had to beg like CLG.EU to scrim us, and none of them wanted to. Like, they just got forced to, basically, by management at the time. And we were like really trying to get teams to scrim against as we went through like the quarters and semis, and Azubu Frost would have none of it. They would never play us. And I actually had a really good rapport with Cloud Templar on that team. Like, we were kind of good buddies. And he actually had a relatively similar play style to me, which was kind of interesting. But I do think that they would always try like different strats and things. And we never really tried new things. We always did the same thing and never deviated from it. And if you go to those games, like game 1, I mean, we won game 1 pretty convincingly. We won game 2 really convincingly. And then game 3 happened. I don't know if you remember that, Duncan, game 3?
Was this the one where you're going to tell me about like you fucked up the buff or something? Was that the one we're talking about?
No, I'm not talking about. I wouldn't talk about my fuck ups. I would talk about someone else's fuck ups.
Was it the Pulsefire Ezreal steal or something? Was that the one we're talking about?
Yeah, I think in game 2 I lost. Was it game 2? I think I lost my red buff because an Ezreal Q.
Like, oh, that's right. It was Ezreal. Yes, he stole the red. Right. Yes.
No, I was talking about. We were actually. We'd won the first game, won the second game, yes. And everyone in like the West was like, I'm gonna go to sleep. Like CLG.EU is like won this, whatever. Okay. And then we're in that third game. We're actually leading really significantly. Like, we've got a glass cannon Jace that's like super fed. It was great. Wicked's like doing well. And then we start getting greedy. And specifically Wickd starts getting greedy. And he's a glass cannon Jace. And he's like, I've got a GA, it doesn't matter. I can do whatever I want. And then you know how that kind of goes. He was basically poking at Baron as they were dancing, doing a Baron dance. And he got turned on. Like, I remember like it was yesterday. And he got like turned on and pops the GA. And we go in to try and save him. And it ends up being messy. And like we lose 3 people. And even though that didn't like lose the game, it was the momentum and like shift. That's all that a Korean team, especially Azubu Frost, needed, was hope that they could possibly win. And then we lost the next 3 games. Like, we lost that game and then the next 2 games after that. And Europe and North America woke up to find out we lost. And God, that was soul crushing. We came so close to being the first Western team to beat Korea in a grand final on home soil. That would have been epic.
So, okay, what I was referring to there, though, is like, I think it was in this series, right? Was the one where, was it this one or the World Semi where there was that thing where you didn't get one of your buffs because, like, I think Krepo, like, sent his animation out, like, slightly too fast and you had the runes that did a crit or something? Something ridiculous like this, right? There was some stupid scenario where, like, I think you didn't get a buff at the beginning of the game. This happened in one of the Frost games, though. So, like, that's the sort of thing, right, that I assume happens like once in a million games because it's like, you know, it's like a one health type.
This was awesome. I remember that. So what you used to do back then? I mean, runes don't even exist anymore. But what you used to do back then is didn't make any sense to have like all crit runes, but it made sense to have one crit rune. It was like a 0.9% chance of a crit happening, because that could exponentially accelerate your jungling speed. But because like that 1% chance was so unlikely most of the time, you're better with like your default runes, you know, to get through the jungle in an efficient clear, and it's like reliable. But it was always good to have that 1%, because then you could maybe exponentially like increase the speed, or not like exponentially, but do it faster.
Yes.
And I got screwed so hard because like typically back then your AD carry and your support would help you do the red buff, and I crit as their auto attack was like flying in and didn't get the red buff, which like just I don't even know if that was Worlds or it was.
I mean, you lost both the matches anyway, so presumably it didn't help either way.
No. But yeah, that was pretty excruciating, and it was funny because after the fact, like, everyone's like, why would you have crit runes? Like, there was genuine like heated discussions on our team about the fact I had a crit rune. That was the root cause of like us losing the game, was me having a crit rune. It was hilarious.
But I mean, what I was going to ask about that though is like, since these were both really close matches, people can even remember like the specific moments. Like obviously in the World Semi, there was like the Skarner catch that they had on yellowpete. That was like the one that really ended the game, right? Since it was so close, do you feel like there was just something unlucky when you played that team? Like somehow it just wasn't going to happen for you? Because I mean, like this example we're giving here about the crit rune is like, it's so outrageously unlikely that would happen and really affect like a key match that you need to win when you're up to, you know, it's just, it seems so implausible, right?
I am bitter about it because I know we came so close. But I wouldn't say that it was luck or anything. Like we had a lot of luck going our way, and the better team won on the day. Like, okay, it's hard to say that, but that's it, right? Like we had a best of 5 series. They won. We had many opportunities to clean that series up. We didn't. They did. And yeah, the best team won. We threw away our opportunity.
Yeah, one thing I've always wondered about from the people who did play in Season 2 is obviously people know the upsides of having the LCS system and having a consistency and knowing exactly when you're going to play and when the playoffs are and how you qualify for Worlds and all these elements, and, you know, being able to have reliable exposure for your sponsors and all these factors that have now become League of Legends esports. But I wanted to know, as a team, was CLG.EU one of the teams that were you impacted by having to go to the LCS system over when you were just like essentially in the old school of esports where you just go to any LAN you want and you kind of choose where you go, and if you want to take a week off here, okay, you do, or if you want to go super hard, you could do 2 in a row, you know? What was the contrast like from going from Season 2 to then having to go into the LCS world?
I think one of the things I loved so much and made me so passionate and invested was the opportunity to travel and like compete in front of different fan bases. And I think as soon as it became the LCS system, it became a job. You know, before I really did like love every second of it. As soon as we went to, you're living in a house and you're going to a studio and you stay in the same house for 4 or 5 days, and the quality, you don't have a quality of life, right? It was just, that's all you did. It definitely became a job, and at that point, it's hard to maintain the same level of passion and excitement and engagement that we experienced in 2012.
Sure. So obviously, when you came into the LCS, phase. You joined Evil Geniuses as the organization. You kept the exact same lineup, but you joined Evil Geniuses. Now, an area I feel like you've never been able to talk about in your interviews in the past was you've referenced before that you kind of took over the role. I mean, obviously you're like the native English speaker. You have you're someone who's been to university. You're a little bit more experienced than some of the other members of the team. You kind of took over the role of being the guy who would go to the organizations and would talk to them about the deals and, try and figure out which org are we going to join. Right? How much did that impact your individual career, like your ability to practice and play the game? Because as far as I know, and from talking to you over the years, it sounds like that when contrasted to most other players in LCS, in fact, practically all of them didn't do any of that. They just played League of Legends. It seems like it at the very minimum, it was in your mind more than anything else, right? How much did it actually take away from like practice time or ability to focus on being the best individual player Snoopeh can be?
I definitely did. As much as I like tried to make it not, and I still practiced as much as other people did, my mind wasn't always only on that. Like for example, when we were flying, it's like we had an obligation with we didn't have an obligation at the time. I was going to CES, and I was going there to do a promo for like Kingston, I think it was.
Okay.
And I was like the brand like the face of the company or the team. And I was going there to like do this brand promo. And then meanwhile, like I was also during that trip in hotel rooms with Curse and EG and CLG negotiating like the entire team's salaries for that year. And that's just stuff that no one else had to think about. I remember I created a deck, like a presentation deck. That was to negotiate with Alex Garfield. I created like a 10-page or 12-page presentation to present to Alex Garfield about why we should get paid what we should get paid. So that was definitely things I was doing, I guess, that no other like player had to do, and it did cause a distraction. Didn't mean I practiced any less, but it definitely meant my mind wasn't solely on being the best player, and that probably impacted me.
Okay.
I don't know, but I probably did.
Because obviously in Season 2, your team, as we've discussed by some of the results, was not just one of the best in Europe, was one of the best in the entire world. And when we come to the LCS era, obviously it was still a good team. You had like third in the first split, and then you just missed out on Worlds in the fourth place. Still a decent enough placing, But one of the factors was, even though the team was still competitive, you were the first player, I remember, took a lot of flack. Like, people criticized you heavily, and they said, like, oh, you just can't play in the modern meta. Because if you remember, this is when you switched away from the supportive style of jungling, and now you had a lot of, obviously, like, carry junglers. And all, I mean, this is when the Insec era came along, where everyone was playing fucking Lee Sin and stuff and was very aggressive, and you could have star players, right? How much of it was the game and trying to adapt to that, and how much was... do you feel like your performance fell off from where it was in the previous seasons?
I don't think my individual performance at like particular heroes, I think the meta shift didn't help. Like the meta shifting that I'd perfected over a full year shifted. And then maybe the fact that I was balancing all these other things in my head meant that I wasn't able to shift to a new meta quickly or had the focus to shift to a new meta. I guess that could be true. But I do think, like, when you think about it, our team played a meta for a year, dominated that meta, and then the meta swapped. That's going to impact you no matter what,
Sure. Was your team actually a bit resistant to adapting? Because, like, obviously in your case, like, it was quite an extreme, like, jungler split, but people forget across the board there were issues. Like, I remember Wickd used to get criticized because obviously in this era, he couldn't just play Aurelia every game. Now people would focus him, and then people claimed he had a small champion pool. Froggen, if you remember, as we went on in the year, there was when they buffed the assassins, and he played as some of them. He'd play like the odd Fizz game or the odd Zed game, but generally he still did want to play like the wave clear, the farming champions, because that was his style. Was your team a bit slow to adapt or a bit resistant, thinking like we can still make the old style work, or we can just play the way we want, as opposed to having to play whatever the current meta is?
I think we were very resistant. And the hard part was like that resistance, like, wasn't all at the same time. You know, it was like, say I was resistant to playing aggro junglers, then Wicked would be like resistant to being a tank as opposed to a carry. And then Froggen would be resistant to not playing like Karthus or whatever it was at the time. And because at different times we were so resistant, we didn't really have a cohesion or like a team comp. So even if like if Froggen really tried to play assassins, like I wasn't playing the aggro jungler to go with that. Okay. Or if Wicked wasn't playing tanks, we had no one to be our front line, you know, and like the rest of the team comp just broke. And you play that over a couple of months, and that just starts to impact, you know, like your performance, your morale, when you're dealing with those losses. And then also there's tension that gets brought in there too, right? Is even though we were a good unit, we still had a lot of tension arising from the shift in meta.
Okay. So I remember one aspect that was quite interesting that a lot of people might not remember was when you were in the second split, the summer one where you were building up to Worlds. This was the split where, for context, it was like one of the most insanely close splits ever, where if you remember, like the last week was that like 5-way tie for second place, and like you had to have a massive play. And it was literally where, I remember, I think it was SK were the ones that missed the playoffs. They could have been second, and instead they ended up going like not even in the playoffs because it was only 8 teams back then. So this is how close it was. So that's the context, right? But because it was so close, and because, you know, one team would lead for 3 weeks and then they'd drop off and another team would lead, this was the split where at times it was going really badly for the CG team. And this was, I remember, where you were one of the first teams to actually bring in an element of coaching, because nRated had been kicked out of Fnatic, and you guys kind of like, I mean, I believe, weren't you like personal friends with him, and you kind of initially, you just brought him in to help out with initially some things, but didn't he actually kind of play some role in helping turn the team around?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, it's kind of interesting because coaching, yeah, wasn't a thing back then, but we felt that we were being like, we had a lot of like bias in our team. Like Froggen was very opinionated. I was very defensive. And Wicked was obviously very strong-minded. And we just needed an outside lens looking in. And that was hard for our team because we never really believed in like anyone. We didn't have an org really. Like we got paid by an org, but we didn't really have any direct coaching or anything at the time. Sure. And that was a hard thing to swallow, someone else to come in and influence us, but it did help a lot. It helped just that other voice, you know, and a team dynamic, that unbiased voice, that their only goal is to make you win, not appease someone or like satisfy your own personal like initiative. And that helped. I don't think it was the only thing, but that non like biased approach really helped us think more about how we were operating as a team. And in that final sprint towards the end of the season, really helped us. And it's also like, I mean, nRated came from one of the other top teams in Europe at the time, right? Yes. And he wasn't like spilling the beans on what they were doing, but he had an understanding of the game in a way in which we didn't, because they just thought their team thought differently. Yes. And that like perspective was really valuable for us. And yeah, I mean, it helped us finish. I can't remember what we came that split, but we didn't do awful. You know,
no,
like we set up to do awful at least, but we didn't end up doing that bad.
Yes. Well, here's the thing. The problem was that was back when the original qualification system for Worlds was just finish top 3 in the playoffs. There was no circuit points or, you know, multiple opportunities. Basically, you didn't go to Worlds because you lost to Fnatic in the semis. Okay, fair enough. Fnatic was very good. And then you played the Gambit team in the 3rd place decider. And I think it even went all 3 games and they just won the last game. So basically, Worlds for you came down to 1 game at the end.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right, since that technically was actually the last game that lineup played together, because obviously after that we had the whole split and they went one route, you went another route. In fact, you even went to different continents. Was it a significant moment at the time when you kind of realized like it's not going to happen? We didn't get to Worlds. Like was there actually any kind of ambience in the team of like this is kind of like the last run?
Was that not in Germany? Like at Gamescom?
Yes, it was at Gamescom because that's where the playoffs was held.
Yeah, and actually we got knocked out by Gambit.
Yes, in the 3rd place decider. But you lost the semis, obviously, to play the 3rd place decider.
Yeah. And there was something like SK deliberately lost. I remember something like SK deliberately lost in that game, too. or like one of the series SK like intentionally lost, and it was some stupid thing like that. That was a really interesting. There was a lot of tension there. Some of that, like, it's hard to get into like personally, but there was like people were out the night before. And this is, I mean, you're talking Worlds, right? This is the qualifier for Worlds.
Sure.
And like people were out the night before, getting drunk and things, and then like come in, and there was personal stuff that happened where like people's girlfriends were off doing other things and all this crazy stuff. And we were one of the best teams in Europe, most fan-loved teams, and we didn't make it to Worlds. It was really heart-crushing for our team, and led to a lot of very frank conversations right after it, where, like for example, Froggen felt he was too good for the team.
Yes.
Didn't want to stay. I'd always wanted. I actually tried to get our team to go to the US in the start of that year. Like I wanted us to move to the US, and basically no one wanted to do it at that point in time for XYZ reasons. Like one was family, the other one is too risky right now.
Sure.
The other was competition, like it's better in Europe. So we ended up not making the move. And I was really passionate about us going to America. Like for me, I felt it was the best thing for our team, like for the longevity of our team. For me personally, I felt it was the best thing for my career to go to America. And I wanted the whole team to come. And I really wanted the whole team to come. But Froggen didn't want to go. Froggen wanted to stay put in Europe. And that's where we then decided, like, okay, does this make sense for just me to go and the other guys to stay? And then I spoke with Pete and I spoke with Krepo, and they both, as we started formulating the team in North America, and I was working with Alex Garfield at the time to put that together, we had to go through the whole, like, can we actually get a spot? Because we had to get that velocity spot and things.
Yes.
And Pete and Krepo decided to come over and take the leap with us to North America.
Okay. So as you referenced there, like, obviously even headed into the like, as I dubbed it, like, you know, the last run, like I remember, like, I've obviously through the years I've had contact with Froggen, you know, I remember every time I've ever asked him about that, he always made it sound like in his mind, if you had have made Worlds, you know, then he would have kind of like seen where it had gone, you know, like, okay, obviously they'd been the only real team he'd been in as a pro, you know. So I think he wasn't necessarily against the idea this team could continue, but I do get the sense that, like, when it just didn't make Worlds, then whatever was in the back of his mind before of, like, thinking he's really good, but, you know, certain members of the team aren't good, or they don't fit the meta or whatever, that's, I think, when it kind of cemented. And then obviously we had this fracture where they were going to build a super team around him, and then you guys went over to NA, right? Was the way it broke up a bit passive aggressive? Like, it doesn't seem like you all got in a room and were screaming at each other, but it kind of felt like afterwards, like the implication was that, like, Froggen and Wickd thought they were really good still, but you guys were kind of like had been left behind, right?
So it's funny that it's put that way, because I don't think there was any tension. Like, that's for sure. There wasn't like well, there was maybe some, like, when they were putting together a super team, and like Pete or Krepo might not have been like considered for it, or Froggen
yes, I
didn't want to.
There was something like that, you know, like one of them thought, oh well, maybe I could try it. I think it might have been Krepo, because Krepo obviously himself used to think, well, you know, I had to play a very simple supportive style because that was to support Pete, you know, and I know he always often thought he never got credit as being a very strong support player and thought he could play Thresh and stuff, you know. So that makes sense, actually, that story of maybe he thought, oh well, maybe I can join the super team, and they were sort of like, yeah, no, we're not going to go in that direction, you know, that sort of a thing.
Yeah, but for the idea of like going to the US wasn't a result of Froggen not wanting to play with us. That had been something that was stewing for like a year in the making, or well, not year, but like 10 months in the making at that point. Because I asked Alex, like, I really wanted us to go to the US the year before, and for me, it didn't actually matter the outcome of anything, Worlds or whatnot. I wanted to go to America, selfishly, and as a team. I just felt it was better for many reasons. Like, Riot was there. Like, you can even tell how it all played out, right? With the investments that Riot's made, and the North American ecosystem. I felt it was the right place to be if we were gonna, you know, be professional gamers in League, you know, and I really like pushed for that, and I was gonna do it no matter what. And I actually would have loved for the whole team to come. Okay. Would have been much better. Froggen had other ideas, and then Wickd was kind of affected by Froggen. And then Krepo, like, I think did want to stay and stay with Pete, but then Froggen kind of didn't want that to happen. And then Krepo and Pete decided to join out in the US. And I think that's how it played out. I wouldn't say that we were going to the US because Froggen didn't want us. Honestly, that was always the plan for me, at least. And I wanted the team to come, but that never quite panned out that way.
Okay, right. I don't know how much you want to say about this. So as ever, no one has a gun to you. You can say anything you want, or you cannot say anything you want. But wasn't there also another component where part of being an Evil Geniuses and wanting to go to America, etc., was, as you said, when you were deciding between the teams, you kind of played the role of like a manager, of an agent. You put together the sponsor deck. You figured out, like, you know, here's how the business works. I'm gonna have to figure out, you know, what's a good salary versus do you get like equity, or what's the brand? You know, all these different factors that someone has to consider. And at the time, you know, esports wasn't as advanced. Wasn't a component of wanting to do this also to be around Alex Garfield, to learn from him, to have perhaps industry experience? What would you say to that?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough. Like, I was starting to build my own network outside of Alex in esports. But honestly, Alex is a really smart guy, and the opportunity to work closer with him and build the brand out in North America, to be closer to Riot, and where like a lot of their core team was something that was really, really appealing to me. And I felt it was going to be better for me in my career. And I wanted to do that, you know, like I wanted the team to come on that journey with me, but I felt really strongly that this is what I wanted to do at that point in my life.
Okay. Right. Since that was the phase where obviously the Froggen and Wickd part of the story leaves your personal story, let me ask about them as players. So let me ask first about Froggen. So as you referenced, actually, coming into the team, he was one of the least well-known players because he was just a guy who played Go for Lols and famously actually initially just only played Anivia like every game, no matter what, in every matchup, you know, and eventually only when he became pro actually did play the other champions, basically, right? As you referenced, Wickd, obviously the fellow Dane, scouted him, brought him in. Right. What was Froggen like during the time you played with him? Because I know now he's learned some of the social aspects to, you know, how to appear on camera, how to do interviews, you know. He's actually a very well-loved player just as a personality, which is funny because as we're referencing before, you know, in the team before, it was like you, maybe Krepo, a bit of Wickd, you know. The others were a bit more in the background. Froggen at the time, as from what I remember, was the guy who really was like the nerd. He was the guy who just played a million hours and he was very, very good as a player, but the rest wasn't as developed, right? So what was he like as a teammate and a player?
Froggen was a very frustrating teammate, especially less so in the initial phases of like CLG.EU. Maybe on the back half he was a little more frustrating, but in that EG phase where his kind of ego and temperament, and I just think he was really young at the time. And we were getting dealt like tough cards. Like we weren't performing as a team, and different people on the team weren't performing well. And he just was not really that mature at the time. So his ego and his passion both clashed, and just made him quite a difficult teammate to work with. And as the team goes through a bad spell, you can't afford to have that in the team if you're really going to fix it and change it. And it was really difficult to have him in the team at some points. As a team player, like he was incredibly smart. Like he was really good at the game, really, really good. And he knew things that no one else knew about how the game worked. And that was incredibly useful. But one of the challenging things was understanding that it was a 5v5 game.
Yes.
And I think you need to be a little more humble in some regards. And I think the further Froggen got in his career, he learned that. I think, unfortunate for us, he didn't learn that as early. And And yeah, I think that was what I'd say is in terms of the person, like Froggen's great. Like he's a great guy. I mean, great to his fans, great to like his friends. But as a teammate, like his ego and his passion kind of clashed and got in the way of being a really effective like team player, I guess.
Since, as we referenced, especially because CLG came up in Season 2 and the meta at the time was basically, unless you were Diamond Prox, you were, jungler was like a ward bot. And in fact, you went to the extreme where, as we said, you really did feed a lot of your resources into Froggen because obviously he was the star player. Did it burn you a bit that later on, when the team wasn't as good, etc., that there was a sense that, I mean, this is definitely a sense outside the team. People used to say like, oh, Froggen's still really good, but oh, he needs like a good jungler, or he needs a better team, Did it burn you a bit that you kind of were very unselfish towards him? And perhaps at the time, do you think he appreciated? Do you think he understood what you gave up?
No, I don't necessarily think that. Like, it's weird because the role I played was this sacrificial, like, crowd control bot, and shot calling in the game. And it was just because you play that role for so long that as soon as you start to shift or try and shift, and it was a hard shift for me, it was really difficult to shift into an aggressive mindset and like a farm mindset. As I shifted, because Froggen's expectation of me was XYZ, he didn't really help me shift or transition. He was just like, well, why can't you just do what Diamond Prox does? And like, I can still take the race because Alex each still takes the race. Like he didn't have much empathy for the transition that I was going through in the meta shift. His assumption was, well, you should just be able to do it, and it didn't really kind of help that transition for me, which, I mean, Byron, it's my role. I should do it, right? It should be the thing that I get better at.
Yes.
But given that we played a certain way for a year as a team, it's going to be a team effort to kind of shift that play style. And I didn't feel like I had the support from him in order to do that. And he probably felt like I wasn't committing to it or being good enough of his expectations at that time. Okay.
So I noticed earlier on when you were talking about Wickd, you used the term, he's very strong-willed or something like that, right? Right. If I wasn't his teammate, right? So I don't have to be nice. I would just say a flaw of Wickd in a way is that he is very stubborn, right? Now, here's the thing. I'll soften that by saying he also does have a very unique quality to him. I have to say, if you ever talk to him one-on-one and you try to ask him about something that maybe the entire scene thinks he does wrong, you should play this champion, or he's too stubborn with this, or he does the wrong build. If you ever actually just talk to him one-on-one, though, and you try to sort of like hear him out, he can somehow come up with all sorts of reasons that sound really great at the time. Like, he does a very good job of sort of convincing you that there's something to it. And obviously, the fact he's so confident about it, in your own brain, you almost start thinking, maybe he's right. Maybe he does have a point there. But what is he like as a teammate then? Because it does seem like he has his own way he's going to play. It's just going to be that way, right?
So Wickd was really it was funny because he was the least mature on the team, I would say, despite him trying to be mature at times. And he was good. He was a good player, and he practiced. But whenever you tried to give him feedback or like say something he disagreed with, there just simply was no reason. There was no reasoning with him. Like he got this nickname Brickid, which wasn't because he played tanks and he was a brick. It was because talking to Wickd was like talking to a brick wall.
Okay.
Yeah. There was just no way of like, whenever he had something in his mind, there was no way of getting past it. And it's actually like, I feel kind of bad for him in some ways because he was one of the more popular players in Europe for a long time.
For sure. Yeah.
And through a string of things that I don't even know what happened, but through a string of things, he just didn't really get his break after him and Froggen stopped playing together.
Yes.
And I haven't spoken to him in a long time, and I hope he's doing okay. But yeah, it was just kind of, it was I think he missed out having big brothers. You know, like I think Krepo and Pete and myself were a pretty good influence on him. And as soon as we disappeared, he wasn't able to make the most out of his pro career and his talent as much as he was when he was at his peak.
Okay. Right. When you went to America and you made the Evil Geniuses lineup there, and you got in Inox and Pobelter, and at the time, obviously, like, you know, these were young players. They were somewhat inexperienced. I mean, Pobelter had played a bit at that point in time, but he hadn't played at LCS level, obviously. Right. When you got these players into the team, was there actually an expectation that the team was going to do really well? Because obviously, I mean, it's not exactly a spoiler. The end result is it never did that well in LCS. You know, there was some struggles there. So what was the expectation when you came into that squad?
We didn't expect to be dominant by any means when we first started out. We came in, we got like a relegate team, like we were just new to moving to the US. We had a lot of like infrastructure-y things to set up as a team, like getting the house and all that stuff. I mean, internet, tables, all that crap. It was just a lot to do at the start of a season. But we really believed that like Inox and Eugene were young talent that was really promising. And we saw it as like a young talent investment, that we bring in the 3 older guys that have got experience, are good players. We weren't amazing by any means at that point, but we're good players. And because we had all this experience and we could bring that with some young blood, we fancied our chances, you know, of doing pretty well.
What was different about NA LCS from EU LCS at that time?
I think the biggest difference was NA LCS was definitely more branding focused than the EU LCS. Like EU LCS was definitely just about like playing the game as much as possible and being the best. So to Froggen's point, I think it held true. There was a certain hunger in Europe that I didn't see as much in North America. North America, like everyone was kind of spoiled, and not lazy, but because we definitely still tried and practiced really hard, but it was definitely less so than Europe, because I think people just got spoiled in general. And I think that was just a byproduct of the way like the infrastructure was. Like we had nice catering, you know, we had a nice studio. It was just very different from Europe. And with that, people became a little bit entitled.
So I remember when this Evil Geniuses lineup had like underwhelming results, eventually, piece by piece, that lineup got taken apart. And you were one of the first players to depart from the lineup. Now, as I remember, that wasn't exactly like the most pleasant parting either, because I remember that tied into that whole story where somehow it got out into the scene, perhaps through Krepo, who can know, that whole scenario where you were out of the team, but you were still in the team house, and therefore everyone remembers this line that Alltech like slept in a stairwell like Harry Potter or something, you know, like what went on with the end of the team? Because it seems like there was a little bit of bitterness with the way that broke up, right?
No, it was really bitter. And I don't want to get too like into the weeds of it, but you recall a guy called Brian Cordray.
Yes, the manager
at the time. And he was not exactly the most competent at his job. And I found out that I wasn't on the team, not from my team or from my manager. Basically, what was happening was he was going to like Altec was going to a player summit. Was it Altec or someone? Who was the other jungler? Again.
I can't remember who replaced you as a jungler at the time, actually.
Oh, Helios. That's
Helios,
it.
yes, that's right.
And Helios was going to the player summit and I wasn't. And that is how I found out that I wasn't on the team. And it was like this really weird exchange because I'd given no lead time, right? It was like, we're going to go test Helios for a little bit, 1 to 2 weeks, just to see if that shifts up. And I was totally on board, by the way. I was like, obviously I didn't like it, but I was like, we're losing. makes total sense. Try something new.
Okay.
And then it was dealt the cards of, like, he is now the permanent replacement on the team without, like, there was no warning on it. He was just like going to his player summon and like representing our team there.
Okay.
And I was like, I had a big falling out with Cordray at the time. And we had all these players, and my life was still there. I had no like second plans. I didn't know what I was doing. Like, I was in the house. This is where all my stuff was. This is where I was living. And we just had a new guy come on, and poor Altec, like, was just left in the bottom of the stairs. I don't think he actually had a big problem about it at the time, but yeah, that happened. And it was a weird situation because I was having to think through my transition without being given the opportunity or the accommodation, like to go through a transition. What happens, hopefully, when a player is no longer with the team, like the manager goes, okay, we're going to think about what you're going to do next. Like, I'm going to help you find a team or like get you set up, XYZ. It was just like, you're no longer in the team as of today at this dinner. And there was no plan, like there was no, this is what's going to happen. So then I like ended up me being into a coaching role and end up in this really drawn out process. And I actually think the reason the process might have became so drawn out was because maybe Cordray was a little bit intimidated by me, and didn't want to communicate that to me, or felt it very difficult to communicate that to me. And then what kind of happened is that extended for a while, and then I went to go buy the team. Basically buy the LCS slot.
Yes.
While I was living at the house.
Okay. Right. This is basically a similar version of the question about when the split happened with Froggen and Wickd, but there's no way to make it not sound loaded, right? Because I have to come up with a question, I have to imagine myself in your position, right? It's one thing if Froggen, who obviously was at a very good level still, and is a young player and is still very hungry and has all these people in his ear, oh, if you just get a different team, or if you played with me, you'd be so much better. Right? I can understand why someone like that might make the move where it's like, right, let's just split apart. I don't want to play with you anymore. But in this setting that yellowpete and Krepo were in, they owed you something, right? I mean, you were part of getting them into Evil Geniuses, and now you've gotten them over to NA, and you've handled a lot of these aspects for them, and you could make a case, as you said, with the whole super team thing. Who knows where they would have gone as players if they'd just all split apart separately and had to fend for themselves in Europe. Doesn't it kind of damage personal relationships a bit in a scenario like this, if in kind of a bit of an underhanded or not very kind of... Well, they didn't own up to it, did they? They didn't just come to you and say, listen, we don't want to use the player anymore. We've had a long time with you and we're just going to try this other thing. They kind of just pulled the rug out from under you a bit. Doesn't that damage your relationship a bit with them?
It definitely did, right? They definitely did. However, I knew it wasn't necessarily like coming right from them. Like, the thing is, like, Pete can't lie. Like,
yes,
he just doesn't have that
program, right? Yeah.
So once like you have the conversation with them, I had the conversation with them, and I mean, it stemmed a similar thing again, right? I mean, this was just me not being as good of a player now anymore, and obviously my focuses and my things, I was getting like a lot more distracted, and it was Eugene like really felt he needed someone better in the mid lane and like wanted to try a Korean jungler, and because that's what everyone was doing at the time. And Mitch definitely, I think at that point in time, didn't communicate with me less, and that maybe damaged our relationship a little bit. But over like talking about it and like working with him through it, like we became very mature about it. I think the good thing is, even though Mitch was very temperamental, he was still, when not, annoyed or angry, was very reasonable and mature. And it was good. It was easy to have a conversation with Pete or him, as long as the conditions or environment was right. And I don't think it damaged our relationship. Not meaningfully, anyway.
Okay. Right. When you referenced there, yellowpete, I wanted to ask about him because obviously he is a player who, of all these players we've mentioned, actually probably been the most forgotten because he was never super vocal anyway. And as a player, he didn't really survive much longer in his career beyond this, definitely not at a high profile level. But he was also a very unusual guy because I remember meeting him and I remember famously, right, this is a story which I think really summarizes, at least from my perspective, what was very unusual about him as a guy, was I remember someone once asked him, right, they said to him, they said, who's going to win this match? And he was, everyone was sat like at LCS watching a match. And he goes, well, how could I know? And they go, no, but who do you think will win it? And he just goes, that's impossible to answer. How could I know? The game hasn't been decided. And he wasn't joking, he wasn't trolling. This is really the way his brain worked. Anyone else would go, they're asking me, in square brackets, who do I think will win this match most likely and why, His brain was like a supercomputer. He could only process he needed all the information somehow to answer this question. So who is yellowpete? Tell me as a teammate. You know him way better than all the rest of us. Who is he?
He's the nicest guy on this planet. That's Pete. Pete was definitely the most mature in the team, and most articulate in how he could communicate. He was a grounding voice within the team. He's like your ideal teammate in some regards. One of the ways that Pete lacked, or one of his weaker qualities, was that he didn't demonstrate passion or real conviction, and that kind of determination never came through, which was always a frustration at various points in playing with him, not just for me, for others on the team as well. We really wanted to see him really care, and that never really came across except very few times. And I think that was probably his weird qualities, but honestly, he's not a bad bone in his body. The guy is one of the nicest, and a smart guy, and just a really, really nice person. Sometimes too nice for his own good, and very logical, as you were just saying. He very, very German in the way he thinks.
Okay, so in terms of Krepo, right? Again, this is where people have to forget the current context. So people will remember the current Krepo was doing amazing as a caster. He looked very polished, he'd really worked on his image. Obviously, he'd lost all the weight, etc. He'd really changed in the later years. But in the early years, again, to give an old story to kind of contrast, right? So when you did that whole movement, which is obviously a fantastic, magnanimous movement where you were doing the get fit with Snoopeh and you were trying to encourage kids that, play the game, yeah, but get fit as well. And let's all lose weight and have fun. People might not remember this, but Krepo, as a troll, did the whole haha, no, get fat with Krepo. And he would eat fucking Twix or a chocolate or something, and obviously almost reveled in the fact that he was being kind of an asshole, in a charming way. He had his own charm, obviously. But I actually know, despite the fact he was a personality as well, and people lumped him in with you and Pete, etc., in his own way, as people will have been able to tell by kind of the undercurrent of some of these stories, he also actually was pretty kind of a driven guy as well, right? He also thought he was very good and wanted to be in the best teams and stuff. So who was Krepo to you?
He was probably my best friend. And sometimes he was definitely over the years my closest friend of my teammates and playing with. He used to be very difficult in that he would get very frustrated and tempered in situations. And it came from his passion. He really cared. He really, really did care. He was the extreme opposite of Pete in that he really cared. And that passion would sometimes come through in the wrong way. But I have a lot of respect for him. And one of the things on that get fat, get fit thing, he'll tell you this himself. I tried for so many years to get him to go to the gym, to engage with us, to come out with me or Pete. I tried a whole healthy Kickstarter thing, hey man, you want this? And he wouldn't, trying to get him to eat new food and things like that. Okay. But he was very much wanting to be the best player, best support player. He was really driven by that and really passionate about the team and not just about playing the game. He believed in team activities. He was really helpful and supportive of what I wanted out of the team. I wanted the team to bond, not just in the game, but out of the game as well. And he was really supportive of that. in general, yeah, he was a great teammate. And especially over the years as he found himself more and, like, you know, became comfortable with who he was and, like, matured, he was just a great teammate.
Over the years, either at the end, at this point, you know, when the playing career aspect had receded and you were technically, as you said, you initially did the transition to coaching, but then obviously left that role as well. Either at that point or earlier, perhaps when the split happened with Froggen and Wickd, were there ever real considerations and real talks about Snoopeh just himself goes to a different team, not with anyone else, not making a team, just Snoopeh joins a team? Was this ever in the cards?
I got approached by a couple of, like, not so good teams, not even the good teams, a couple of not so good teams, and wasn't really compelled by it. But all honestly, my motivation, like, towards the end of my playing career, I wanted to be on the business side. That's what made me excited, like being a part of understanding how the industry worked, building the industry, making it bigger. I was always drawn to that since the early in my playing career. And towards the end, that's what I wanted to do. You know, it's like you have your thing, your calling, whatever, and, like, that's what was calling me, right? I really wanted to be involved in the business side of esports, and that's what I went and pursued.
Okay, so I remember one thing that you actually initially looked like you were going to go and do was become something like you were going to found the player union, right? This is a long time ago, and by the way, there is still to this day no League of Legends pro player union. So what was the impetus behind that, and why could it never come together? Because I know, just as a bit of context, over in CSGO, a friend of mine, Richard Lewis, tried a similar thing, and he also, you know, he got a certain way down the path and he hoped he could go further, and then it seems like there's something in trying to do this that at these points in esports, logistically, you just couldn't get it done. So what were the challenges, and why did that kind of fall apart?
Yeah, I went really deep into it. I spent months, given that I was a player and I had a decent image and brand and was relatively, like, articulate, and really cared about players and player rights and all sorts of things. I thought I could go out and create a player union, and I thought that was the right thing to do too. And as I got deeper into it and I learned and I spoke to different, like, government officials, I spoke to different lawyers, spoke to Riot, spoke to Twitch. I got really deep down this path and basically realized how someone in my position was not set up to do this. I don't think it's impossible, but bear in mind, I hadn't made a lot of money, right? I made not nothing, but I had some decent savings. But I'm here in America. I'm trying to do something with relatively little funding. I don't have a house. It's not my place. Like, I don't have an apartment. Sure. And I am going to try and start an altruistic players union with no funding, and, like, get all of these players who don't really care about it to buy into it, and create an official entity that, given the way the gaming industry works and, like, how Riot's role in that is with their IP, it was just a really complicated thing. And it's not impossible, but a very difficult thing to pull off, and I was not in the position to do it. I then went down looking, okay, a player union doesn't make sense. It's a bit too early in the industry to do that. What about a players like an advocacy board? So that what's the association? Sorry, okay. And it's a tamer word, I guess. And I looked at that, and I have a full deck. I presented a 8-page deck to Twitch and asked them to fund a player association back in whatever year that was. This was prior to the Good Game acquisition. I said they should get into player, basically helping support the player ecosystem as opposed to the team ecosystem. And they obviously opted for the team ecosystem, yes, which did backfire pretty considerably. But I really believe that they should support a players ecosystem and basically make sure that everyone had agency representation, had a lawyer, basically bootstrap this player association, and then it would turn over to the players paying for it later down the line. And again, that never materialized. Couldn't get the funding for it or the right people to support it. And there was very few people with had the interests to do it. Twitch was really the only one, and there wasn't anywhere near the amount of funding that's in the industry now back then. And then I looked into owning a team. Was the kind of next chapter of me on Snoopeh's little business adventures.
Okay. So on these adventures, I noticed that a constant theme is they all have to take place in America somehow. America's like the place for you. Now listen, you don't have to sell me on that, Snoopeh. I come from the northeast of England. You come from Scotland. So if you go to LA for, let's say, 2 weeks, and you think to yourself, when's it going to start raining? And you come from where we come from, immediately that's a good enough reason right there as to why you'd never go home again and why you just find a way to live there. It's beautiful weather. It's great for business. Obviously, esports was booming at that point in time. But you had all these different little adventures, as we've mentioned, potentially owning a team, trying to do the union. I know you spent a lot of time trying to get permanent residency, get a green card, etc. What's the big draw of America? And what can you tell us at the end of the interview kind of about where you currently are in your career and what you're doing, and perhaps a few details you can spare us?
So I think for me, the reason I really always pursued and loved America is I came from a very small town in Scotland where the opportunity to do things had somewhat of a ceiling, or it seemingly had a ceiling, and I wasn't exposed to very much. And had my dad not passed and had pro gaming not happened, I would have probably ended up in a 9-to-5 office job in Scotland. And that's not bad, right? Sure. For some people at all. But I've been really fortunate in that I got exposed to different things in the world, and different experiences, and gave me the opportunity to come to America and really grow my career substantially, and perhaps raise a family out here in the US, really establish myself in the games industry. And now I went through very, very many phases. I tried to raise institutional money in the ecosystem when there was no institutional money. I tried to raise $1.5 million, got $800K, with really no support or understanding, but managed to raise $800K from VCs, which was interesting. I worked at a startup for a year and really tried to teach myself. I really wanted to capitalize on all the opportunities I'd been given and throw myself into uncomfortable situations for basically pursuing growth, things that would help me grow. Okay. And worked at a startup, found that interesting and challenging in its own way. Then I did consulting for a while after that startup. And that was interesting because I was meeting so many interesting and cool people. I was meeting with billionaires. I was meeting with the biggest brands in the world, like Coke and McDonald's and Chase. And then I got to meet all these famous people in sports that I had no idea who they were, and was starting to go to sporting games that I had no interest in. And that was really cool because I was making a lot of money, meeting a lot of cool people. But then I felt very uncompelled by money. Money started to lose meaning. It's always I want money. I like money, right? I like nice things. I like doing nice things. But the idea of just making a lot of money became less compelling over time. And I felt like I wasn't learning anymore or growing when I started doing the consulting. I mean, everyone knows a consultant in esports, right? And you can argue I was relatively qualified, but there's definitely more qualified people out there that work at these massive consulting companies. Sure. And I felt I needed to grow and learn more, and I felt like I could do more for the industry and space. And I got approached by Facebook to join them for a while, a year and a half ago or 2 years ago now. And I first said no to them. I really didn't want to join because I didn't want to join a big company. I had all this autonomy for 6 years, and I loved that autonomy. I could do what I want, live where I want. And then I started thinking about that, what it would mean to join a big company, and then looked at all the different companies, whether it was Amazon, Facebook, Google, or Microsoft. And it gave me it made me realize that it was the opportunity to do something bigger than just me. And I'm not like completely altruistic by any means. Like I get paid well, I have a nice job, you know, like
Sure.
setting me up for my career and everything. But it was the opportunity for me to do something that was really meaningful and impact a lot of people. And now I'm at Facebook. I'm working on making one of the biggest games companies, or one of the biggest companies in the world, doing more in an industry that gave me so much, in an industry that I love, because I don't think we're doing enough in this space right now, and we can do a lot more. And one of the things I focus on is gaming video and making Facebook a better place to watch, but watch games. But more importantly, it's like I got so much from this. I mean, I was a 19-year-old kid in Scotland that easily could be still back there right now. And now I dropped out of university and I'm now working at one of the best tech companies in the world, getting to do something I love and build cool shit, you know? And I'm incredibly lucky. And every single day I work long days. You know, it's not an easy life by any means. In California, top down on the convertible with the sun coming in is definitely not difficult or hard. But I love what I do, and I feel like I'm in a position to make a real difference in this industry. And that's not just esports; it's games all up. And I think that's a really cool, unique place to be. And we've done some interesting things at Facebook over the past year. I think we're going to do a lot more interesting things over the next year. And yeah, I'm incredibly grateful and thankful for everything I've been given and gotten to do, honestly.
Okay. So, I mean, it sounds like you touched on part what I'm about to ask now, but at the end of the interview, do you have a final message or someone you want to thank or say hello to?
I think that was a great kind of tee off for how I feel right now. But I guess the biggest thing I would want to say is that I learned at a relatively young age that it's important that you really have confidence in yourself and enjoy the ride. You know, don't get too caught up in day to day, but really enjoy the ride. I am incredibly lucky. I've got a job that I love. I met my wife out here. I am just incredibly grateful for all the fans that supported me over the years, for what this industry, what esports and gaming gave me. Yeah, I'm happy. You know, shit's awesome. And thank you, Duncan, for having me on the show. It's been a while. It's good to catch up. And I see you're not getting any younger, which means that's going to hit me too.
Mate. Yeah, like a ton of bricks I'm betting. Listen, I never built my whole thing on my looks, mate. So, you know, I was kind of flying under the radar anyway. So we'll just leave it at that, shall we?
Yeah. Thank you, Duncan.
Hey, this is Travis Gafford, the double lift expert, and you're watching Thorn's YouTube channel.